Amani Carter had always been a strong, determined young woman, driven by ambition and a relentless pursuit of justice. But all of that was stripped away the day she was framed for a crime she didn't commit. One moment, she was building a promising future; the next, she found herself at the center of a cruel and meticulously orchestrated conspiracy. It all happened so fast. The evidence against her was overwhelming, too perfect, too precise, as if someone had carefully planted every piece to ensure her downfall. The people she trusted turned against her, either too afraid to stand by her side or too eager to believe the lies. Every attempt to prove her innocence was met with walls too high to climb. The justice system, the very institution she had once believed in, betrayed her, manipulated by those with power, influence, and secrets to protect. The courtroom was suffocating. As the guilty verdict was read, Amani felt the weight of the words crash over her like a tidal wave. Shock. Desperation. Then anger. She wanted to scream, to fight, to make them see the truth. But the cold, indifferent expressions of the judge and jury told her everything she needed to know. They had already decided her fate long before she ever had a chance to defend herself. Prison was another kind of nightmare. The metal bars, the suffocating walls, the constant feeling of being watched, it was meant to break her. But Amani refused to surrender. Beneath the crushing weight of injustice, a fire burned inside her. She would not be just another victim. She would not let them win. Day by day, she pieced together the fragments of the truth. Who had set her up? Why? Who benefited from her downfall? The answers were buried beneath layers of deception, but she would find them. No matter how dangerous the path, no matter how many obstacles stood in her way, she would expose the ones who had done this to her. She had lost everything, her freedom, her reputation, even the life she once knew. But one thing remained, her will to fight. And she would fight until the truth was known and justice was finally served. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant hum of the city beyond the alleyways. Streetlights flickered uncertainly, casting long, wavering shadows that danced along the cold pavement. Amani Carter walked briskly, the sharp tap of her heels echoing through the empty streets. There was an unease in the air, something she couldn't quite place, but it gripped her chest like an unseen hand. She had always trusted her instincts. They had guided her through difficult cases, through tangled webs of lies and deceit. But tonight, something felt different. The tension in her shoulders refused to ease, and the prickling sensation at the back of her neck told her she was being watched. Paranoia? Or was it something more? It had started subtly, little things she could almost dismiss. A misplaced document. A colleague's lingering stare before quickly looking away. Whispers that stopped the moment she entered the room. Then, the anomalies grew more concerning. A crucial report she had filed vanished from the system. A conversation she never had was recorded in her name. Before she could make sense of it all, the accusations began. At first, she laughed them off. A misunderstanding, surely. But the evidence was undeniable, each piece carefully placed to paint a damning picture of her guilt. A financial discrepancy she had no knowledge of. Emails she never sent. Witnesses swearing they had seen her in places she had never been. Amani fought to keep her composure as the walls closed in around her. Panic threatened to take hold, but she forced herself to breathe, to think. Someone was orchestrating this, someone powerful enough to manipulate records, fabricate proof, and turn people against her. Betrayal stung sharper than any blade. Colleagues she had trusted for years now avoided her gaze, their loyalty crumbling under the weight of fear. She searched their faces, hoping to find at least one person willing to stand by her, but there was only silence. As she sat in the interrogation room, the cold metal of the chair biting into her skin, she realized the horrifying truth: she had been outplayed. Every move she made had been anticipated, every possible escape route already blocked. But they had underestimated her. She might be alone, her reputation in ruins, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. Beneath the fear, beneath the anger, there was something else, a quiet, burning determination. She would find out who had done this. she would expose the ones who had plotted in the shadows. And when she did, she would bring them down, no matter the cost. The cold, unyielding steel dug into Amani's wrists, the iron shackles biting into her skin like the fangs of a relentless predator. Every movement sent a jolt of pain through her arms, but she refused to surrender to the agony. The damp air in the cell reeked of mold and despair, the dim torchlight casting long, sinister shadows against the cracked stone walls. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant, muffled laughter of the guards outside. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Panic was the enemy. She had been here for too long, framed, betrayed, and discarded like a pawn in a cruel game. They thought she was weak. They thought she was broken. But they were wrong. With slow, deliberate movements, she twisted her wrists against the cold metal, searching for any weakness. The rusted chains groaned slightly under the pressure. Her pulse quickened. There was a chance, small, but real. A single moment of hesitation could mean death, but hesitation was a luxury she couldn't afford. She took a deep breath, bracing herself. Then, with all her strength, she wrenched her wrist in a sharp, precise motion. A sickening snap echoed through the cell, pain shot up her arm, white-hot and searing. She bit down on her lip to muffle the cry threatening to escape her throat. Blood dripped from the fresh wound, but the shackle had loosened just enough. She gritted her teeth and pulled. The metal scraped against her skin as she worked her hand free, the raw flesh screaming in protest. One more tug, and then, suddenly, she was free. The shackle fell to the ground with a soft clink. Her breath was ragged, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. But there was no time to waste. The other wrist. The same maneuver. More pain. More blood. Another shackle undone. She pressed her ear against the thick wooden door. The guards were still talking, their voices casual, unaware. A mistake. A fatal one. She clenched her fists, her body tensed like a coiled spring. Freedom was so close, just beyond that door. A fire burned in her chest, not just the desire to escape, but the thirst for justice, for vengeance. They had tried to break her. They would regret not finishing the job. Judge Harrison had once been regarded as the embodiment of fairness and impartiality. His name was spoken with a certain reverence in courtrooms across the city. When people entered the courtroom, they believed that justice would be served. But over time, the pressure of his position, the lure of wealth, and the temptation of power slowly began to corrupt him. What began as small compromises, overlooking a bribe here, turning a blind eye to a questionable verdict there, grew into a pattern that no longer felt like a choice but an addiction. The people who appeared before him were mere pawns in his game. He listened to their pleas, but the glint of money, the promise of favors, and the whisper of threats shifted the scales in favor of those who could afford him. The law became something to be manipulated, a mere tool in his hands to ensure his comfort and to satisfy his growing appetite for power. He began to believe in his own invincibility. After all, who would dare to challenge a man so deeply embedded in the system? But as the years passed, cracks began to form in the walls he had so carefully built around himself. Rumors started to circulate, faint at first, like a breeze carrying whispers of truth. People, once too afraid to speak, now whispered about the judge's corruption. The very people he had wronged, the innocent souls whose lives he had ruined for his gain, began to rise up. The voices of the oppressed became louder, no longer silenced by fear. Judge Harrison tried to ignore the whispers, convincing himself that they were nothing more than empty threats. He continued his work with the same cold detachment, his eyes scanning the courtroom with an air of superiority. But deep down, a gnawing unease began to settle in. The foundations of his power were crumbling, and he could feel it. He started to notice the glances, the hushed conversations, the odd way people no longer looked at him with respect, but with suspicion. One fateful day, everything came crashing down. The investigation that had been quietly building behind closed doors was finally brought into the open. A dossier, thick with evidence of his crimes, was placed before him. His heart sank as he looked at the stack of documents, testimonies from those he had betrayed, bank statements detailing bribes, and court records that exposed his biased rulings. His mind raced, his breath shallow as he tried to gather the fragments of his pride. He had lived his life believing that the system he had built could protect him, but now he saw it for what it truly was, a crumbling edifice. The courtroom was packed the day the trial began, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Harrison, once the ruler of this space, now stood in the defendant's seat, vulnerable and exposed. The same courtroom that had once felt like a fortress now seemed cold and alien. His robes, once a symbol of authority, felt heavy with guilt as he stood in silence, his gaze shifting nervously from the judge to the gallery. For the first time, his mind was clouded with fear. The faces that once bowed to him were now full of judgment, and the weight of every life he had destroyed came crashing down on his shoulders. As the trial unfolded, the magnitude of his actions hit him with a force he had never anticipated. Every witness that took the stand, every victim who spoke of the pain he had caused, made his world smaller and smaller. It was impossible to look away now, impossible to deny the truth that had always been there, hidden in the dark corners of his mind. He was no longer the powerful judge who controlled the lives of others, he was a man trapped in the consequences of his own choices. And then, the gavel fell. Guilty. The word rang through the courtroom, louder and more final than anything he had ever heard. It echoed in his ears, reverberating through his chest, and for a moment, he was suspended in time. The finality of it was suffocating. All the wealth, power, and influence he had amassed throughout the years couldn't undo the damage he had caused. The courtroom, once his domain, had become his prison. As the sentence was read, Harrison's body went numb. He tried to hold on to some semblance of control, but the truth was undeniable. The world he had so carefully constructed was collapsing around him. The cold hand of justice, which he had so ruthlessly wielded against others, was now gripping his own wrist. He had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. The handcuffs clicked shut, and with them, the last remnants of his power vanished. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent years sentencing others to lives behind bars, never once considering that he, too, could end up in the same place. He had manipulated, betrayed, and destroyed lives, believing he was above reproach. But now, as he was led away in shackles, he felt the full weight of his own transgressions. The corrupt judge had paid the price for his greed, and it was a price that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Justice, after all, has a way of catching up with everyone. Amelia had lived most of her life in the shadows of fear. She was a woman defined by the absence of her own voice. Throughout her childhood, she had been a silent observer to the chaos in her home. Her parents' arguments, the emotional neglect, and the cold, isolating silence that followed each confrontation had taken a heavy toll on her. As she grew older, those habits of silence, of hiding, followed her like a shadow. She became conditioned to believe that the best way to survive was to stay small, to keep her opinions and her pain locked away. It was easier to let the world pass by and let others make the choices for her. She had never questioned it, it had been her way of surviving. But in the pit of her stomach, a constant restlessness had always lingered, an uncomfortable knowledge that this wasn't the way life was meant to be. Still, Amelia stayed quiet, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace she had created around herself. Every job she worked, every relationship she entered, she carried the same weight of oppression. She was used to being the one who bent to the will of others, afraid to assert herself, to make any waves. The abuse she silently endured in her romantic relationships only reinforced the cycle. She had convinced herself that this was her fate, that she was meant to endure, to suffer, but never to fight back. But one evening, as she walked home from work, something changed. She had just finished a shift at a dull office job, her mind exhausted, her body aching from the mundane monotony. As she passed a small park, she noticed a woman standing by a bench, handing out flyers. Amelia barely registered it at first, but something stopped her. A word on the flyer caught her eye: empowerment. The word echoed in her mind as she passed by, like a spark igniting something deep within her that she didn't even know was there. Empowerment. She had never thought of herself as someone who could be empowered, someone who could rise above the life she had been given. It felt like a distant concept, something meant for other people, stronger, braver people. But Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that this was her chance. She stopped and turned back. With hesitant fingers, she took a flyer from the woman, whose warm smile didn't quite match the seriousness of the message she was spreading. Amelia's heart pounded as she walked away, the word support group standing out clearly in her mind. She folded the flyer carefully and tucked it into her purse. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the question, what if? The next morning, something in her had shifted. She felt it in her bones, a quiet strength rising to the surface, pulling her forward. For the first time in years, Amelia felt the stirrings of hope. She walked into that support group not knowing what to expect but knowing that it was time to change. The thought terrified her. What if they judged her? What if her story wasn't worth telling? But she couldn't go back to the way things had been. She had to try. The room was warm and welcoming, filled with people of all ages, backgrounds, and experiences. They spoke with an honesty that struck Amelia deeply. Each person's story was different, yet there was an underlying similarity, the feeling of being trapped, of being overlooked and silenced. As they shared their pain, their fears, and their struggles, Amelia began to feel a connection, something she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. But it wasn't just their stories that moved her. It was the way they spoke of their strength, of how they had fought back, how they had clawed their way out of the darkness. The realization slowly dawned on her, these were not just victims. These were survivors. And she could be one of them too. It was hard, at first. Amelia was painfully shy, terrified to speak in front of others. But one evening, she found herself opening up, just a little. Her voice quivered as she shared a brief piece of her story. She was surprised by the relief that washed over her afterward, the weight that had been lifted, even if just a little. With each meeting, she found herself talking more, pushing past the walls she had built around herself. She began to feel something she had forgotten existed, her own power. Soon, she took on more responsibilities. She started to volunteer at local shelters, helping others who had been through similar experiences. The more she gave, the more she realized how much she had to offer. She wasn't just helping others, she was helping herself. Amelia began to see herself as a leader in the making, someone who could speak out, who could make a difference. She started reaching out to others who had suffered in silence, offering them the same support and encouragement she had received. She started attending rallies, giving speeches, and advocating for the rights of survivors. Her fear, though still present, began to fade. It was replaced with a quiet resolve, a determination to be heard. Amelia's transformation was not an easy one. There were days when the weight of her past threatened to pull her back into the darkness. There were moments when she doubted herself, when the old voices in her head whispered that she wasn't strong enough, that she didn't deserve to take up space. But she refused to listen. With each act of courage, each time she stood up for herself or others, she grew stronger. The chains that had bound her for so long began to loosen, one by one. Her journey from victim to fighter was marked by small victories, each one building on the last. It was a slow process, but it was real. The more she fought for others, the more she fought for herself. Amelia had discovered the strength that lay dormant within her all along. She had gone from a woman who once cowered in fear to one who faced the world head-on. She had broken free from the suffocating silence that had defined her for so long, and in doing so, she had found her voice. Amelia was no longer just a survivor, she was a fighter, someone who would never again allow herself to be silenced. The path ahead wasn't always easy, but it was hers to walk, and she would walk it with the knowledge that, no matter the darkness that tried to consume her, she had the power to rise. Lena had always been the quiet one, the one who never stood out in a crowd. Growing up in a small, dimly lit house on the outskirts of town, she felt the weight of isolation press down on her every day. Her parents, both emotionally distant, had long ago carved out their roles in her life. Her father, a strict and unforgiving man, ruled the house with an iron fist. Her mother, while loving, was as trapped in her own quiet despair as Lena was in her silence. The house was a place of routine, predictable, suffocating, and unyielding. For as long as Lena could remember, the walls of the house had always felt like a prison. They weren't just physical barriers but emotional ones. The faint smell of old wood and the faded wallpaper seemed to remind her every day of the life she had never been allowed to live. There were dreams she had, dreams of freedom, of laughter, of exploring the world beyond, but those dreams always felt like something far out of her reach. Each day blended into the next, and she learned to silence the desire for change, afraid to disturb the fragile balance that held her world together. But the dreams never ceased. Every night, as she lay awake in her bed, her mind raced with possibilities. What if she could escape this small world? What if she could find her voice? And yet, each time she reached for these hopes, they slipped through her fingers, and she was forced to face the reality of her life once more. One evening, as Lena was returning home from the corner store, a figure caught her eye. A woman, standing at the foot of the street, dressed in a long coat with a mysterious air about her. Lena's curiosity piqued, but she quickly averted her gaze and hurried home. The thought of the woman lingered in her mind, but she didn't think much of it. Life was too heavy to entertain fleeting encounters with strangers. The next night, however, the woman appeared again, this time standing right outside Lena's door, knocking softly but insistently. Lena froze for a moment, heart racing, her mind scrambling to make sense of this intrusion. Who was she? What did she want? Despite every warning instinct in her body, Lena found herself opening the door. "Hello," the woman said, her voice soft but confident. "My name is Julia." Lena didn't know what to say. She stood frozen, the door halfway open, caught between the safety of her home and the unknown of what this woman might bring. "I know this is strange," Julia continued, stepping closer as if there were no barrier between them. "But I can help you. I know what you've been going through, Lena. I see it in your eyes. You don't belong here, trapped by these walls. And I can show you how to break free." Lena stared at her, disbelief washing over her. How could this stranger know anything about her life, her struggles? She had kept her pain hidden so carefully, buried so deep inside. But as Julia spoke, something inside Lena stirred, something that had been dormant for so long. She hesitated, torn between the familiar security of her cage and the possibility of something greater. For the first time, Lena felt a spark of hope, a flame that began to flicker in the darkest corners of her soul. Julia's eyes were unwavering, as if she could see every fear, every doubt Lena held. "You're not alone. You don't have to live like this. You can fight for your freedom, but you must trust me." Despite her hesitation, Lena found herself nodding. What was there to lose? Her life had become a routine, a series of days spent in the shadow of others' control. Perhaps Julia was the key to something she had only ever dreamed of. Over the following weeks, Julia returned, each time offering Lena a glimpse into a world she had never known. They would meet late at night when the house was quiet, and Lena's parents were fast asleep. Each conversation felt like an awakening, a slow unraveling of the chains that had bound Lena's mind for years. Julia spoke of the power of choice, of breaking free from the invisible bars that held them all captive. It wasn't easy. At first, Lena doubted herself. How could she, someone so small and insignificant, ever hope to escape the life she had always known? But with every word Julia spoke, every secret she revealed, Lena's world began to shift. She learned that the walls around her were not made of stone, they were made of fear, of conditioning, of the lies she had been told about who she was and what she deserved. But there was a price to pay for awakening. As Lena began to change, so did her relationships with those around her. Her father, ever watchful, noticed the subtle shifts in her behavior. He saw the fire igniting in her eyes, the way she held her head higher, as if she were no longer bound by his rules. His anger flared. He had always controlled her, kept her small and quiet, but now something was different. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew it terrified him. One evening, after a particularly long conversation with Julia, Lena returned home to find her father waiting by the door. His arms crossed over his chest, his face twisted in a mixture of confusion and rage. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice sharp like a whip. Lena felt a surge of panic, her heart thudding in her chest. But something had changed within her. The fear that once paralyzed her now only fueled her determination. She straightened her back and looked him directly in the eyes. "I've been learning," she said, her voice steady but full of defiance. "I've been learning to live my own life, not the one you chose for me." Her father's face hardened, and for a moment, Lena feared he would lash out. But something else flickered behind his eyes, fear. Lena could see it. He was afraid of losing control, afraid of the power she had begun to claim for herself. That night, Lena made a choice. She packed a small bag, her heart pounding with the weight of what she was about to do. She had known for some time that the house, the walls, the life her father had built for her, none of it was her own. She could no longer live someone else's truth. She had to walk away. As she stepped out into the cool night air, Lena felt a mix of emotions, fear, exhilaration, and a deep sense of clarity. She wasn't running from her past, she was running toward her future. The secret behind the bars was not about escaping physically, it was about freeing her mind, her spirit, from the shackles that had defined her for so long. With each step, Lena shed the old version of herself, the girl who had been afraid to dream, afraid to hope. She was no longer the victim of her circumstances, she was a woman who had found her voice, her power. And as she walked away from the house that had held her captive for so long, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would no longer be defined by the secret behind the bars, but by the strength she had found within herself. Lena had always believed in the system, believed that justice, in its purest form, was the guiding force that would set things right. Growing up, her father, a local lawyer, had instilled in her the idea that no matter the obstacles, truth would always prevail. The law was supposed to be fair, impartial, and equitable for all. It was a promise, a beacon of hope for those who had no other recourse. But as the wheels of her own world began to turn in ways she could not have anticipated, Lena's idealistic view of justice crumbled before her very eyes. The first crack in her belief came when her older brother, Daniel, was arrested. It wasn't just any arrest, it was an arrest that shook her to her core. One ordinary evening, Daniel, someone who had spent his life helping others, someone who never strayed from the path of integrity, found himself accused of a crime he hadn't committed. He had been at the wrong place at the wrong time, and because of it, his life was suddenly in the hands of the justice system. It didn't matter that he had an alibi. It didn't matter that witnesses could attest to his innocence. The accusations were clear, Daniel was guilty, and he was going to be punished for it. Lena could hardly breathe as she stood in the doorway of their family home, watching as the police hauled Daniel away in handcuffs. Her mind raced, refusing to accept what was happening. "This isn't possible," she whispered to herself, her hands trembling as she gripped the doorframe. Her brother, the man she had admired, the one who had always protected her, was now being treated as a criminal. She rushed to the courthouse on the day of the trial, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hardly focus as the proceedings unfolded before her. She wanted to believe that the truth would come out, that the justice system would see the injustice being done to her brother. But the courtroom was cold, indifferent, and impersonal. The judge, a man once known for his fairness, barely looked up from his papers. The prosecutor, a man notorious for his aggressive tactics, was relentless, making Daniel out to be a monster with every word he spoke. The defense attorney, overworked and underprepared, seemed to shrink under the pressure. Lena sat in the back of the room, watching the trial unfold, her stomach twisted in knots. Each passing moment felt like an eternity. The evidence presented against Daniel was weak, full of contradictions. Witnesses who could have exonerated him were dismissed as unreliable, their testimonies ignored. The jury, swayed by the weight of the prosecutor's words and the atmosphere of the courtroom, seemed to have already made up their minds. The truth didn't matter. The facts didn't matter. What mattered was that the system had already decided who was guilty and who was innocent, and Daniel wasn't on the right side of that decision. When the verdict was finally announced, Lena felt the blood drain from her face. Guilty. The word echoed in her ears like a death knell. Her brother, the man who had never harmed a soul, was now sentenced to years behind bars. It didn't matter that the truth was on his side. It didn't matter that he was innocent. The system had failed him, just as it had failed so many others before him. As the months passed, Lena's anger grew, and with it, a deep sense of betrayal. How could the system that she had trusted her entire life be so broken? How could the law, meant to protect the innocent, become an instrument of oppression? Every time she thought about her brother locked away in that cold, unforgiving cell, her heart broke all over again. She felt a fire stir inside her, a burning need to do something, anything, to make things right. She began to research. She read every case file she could find, spoke to anyone who might have insights into the workings of the legal system. The more she learned, the more she realized that her brother's case was not an isolated incident. The system was riddled with corruption, biased against the poor, the powerless, and the marginalized. The police had fabricated evidence. The judge had taken bribes. The prosecutor had manipulated the truth to secure a conviction. It wasn't just Daniel who had been wronged, it was a cycle that had been repeating for years, perhaps for decades. Lena's frustration boiled over into action. She started speaking out, first quietly, then louder, determined to expose the truth. She met with journalists who were skeptical at first, but who eventually came to see the depth of the corruption she was describing. She gathered evidence, spoke to former employees of the courthouse who had witnessed the corruption firsthand, and began to unravel the layers of deceit that had been allowed to fester for so long. Each new revelation seemed to dig her deeper into a web of danger, as those in power tried to silence her at every turn. But Lena refused to back down. She wasn't going to let her brother's unjust imprisonment go unanswered. She wasn't going to let the truth be buried by lies. It was no longer just about Daniel, it was about all the victims of a broken system. As the walls of corruption began to crumble, Lena found herself at the center of a storm, her every move watched by those who had the power to destroy her. In the face of threats, intimidation, and countless attempts to discredit her, Lena grew more determined than ever. She had seen the ugly underbelly of the justice system, and she could not unsee it. She knew that the road ahead would be dangerous, that her fight could cost her everything, but she was willing to take that risk. The truth mattered more than her safety, more than her comfort, more than her fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the truth began to emerge. Investigations into the judge, the prosecutor, and the police officers involved in Daniel's case were launched. Evidence was uncovered that proved the corruption Lena had been fighting to expose. The judge was arrested, the prosecutor's career was ruined, and the police officers who had planted evidence were fired. Daniel's conviction was overturned, and he was released from prison, his name cleared. But even as Lena embraced her brother, tears of relief streaming down her face, she knew the battle wasn't over. The system that had wronged him was still in place, still broken, still favoring the powerful and punishing the powerless. She had won this fight, but the war for justice was far from finished. The truth had triumphed, but it was only a small victory in a much larger battle. Lena wasn't done. She couldn't be. With her brother free, Lena turned her attention to the next fight. The struggle for justice was no longer a matter of idealism, it was a matter of survival. If she didn't keep pushing, if she didn't continue to expose the truth, the system would continue to destroy lives, just as it had destroyed Daniel's. She had found her voice, and now it was time to make sure it was heard, no matter the cost. Lena had always been a staunch believer in the concept of justice. Raised with the idea that the law existed to protect the innocent, she grew up trusting the judicial system, convinced that fairness was the backbone of society. She had always thought that anyone, regardless of their background or wealth, could expect a fair trial, that truth and justice would always prevail in the end. But when her brother, Daniel, was wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit, that illusion was shattered. It all started with a single phone call, one that forever changed Lena's life. Daniel had been arrested for the murder of a local business owner, a crime he had no part in. His alibi was airtight, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, but the police didn't seem interested in that. They were determined to pin the crime on someone, and Daniel, with his history of minor run-ins with the law, became their easy target. He was a convenient scapegoat, and his innocence meant nothing in the face of a system more concerned with closing the case quickly than uncovering the truth. At first, Lena was in disbelief. She had known her brother for all her life. He was kind-hearted, hard-working, and had no reason to harm anyone. Yet, the court had already painted him as a cold-blooded murderer. As she sat in the courtroom, listening to the prosecutor distort facts, Lena's chest tightened with each passing word. The judge, once a figure she'd admired for his fairness, sat motionless, uninterested in the evidence Lena knew could set her brother free. The defense lawyer, overwhelmed and underprepared, struggled to make a compelling case. Lena felt a mixture of helplessness and growing anger. How could this be happening? How could a system she had always trusted fail her brother so completely? The days dragged on, and with each new court session, Lena's frustration mounted. Every time she thought she might catch a break, another piece of the puzzle fell apart. The judge seemed disinterested, almost as though he had already made up his mind. It was clear that he was influenced by something beyond the law. His mind was made up, and no amount of evidence could change it. Lena's anger soon turned to disbelief, and then to an overwhelming sense of betrayal. The judicial system, which she had always believed would protect her loved ones, was failing her. It was failing Daniel. And then, the verdict came, guilty. Lena felt as though the world had fallen away beneath her feet. The sound of the gavel echoed in her ears, a final blow that sealed her brother's fate. Her heart broke as she looked at Daniel's face, his eyes filled with disbelief and sorrow, but also with something else, something that Lena couldn't quite place. He was resigned. He had always been the strong one, but now, he seemed defeated. His once bright future had been snatched away, and there was nothing Lena could do to stop it. But Lena wasn't one to sit back and accept defeat. Her grief, while deep, soon gave way to something much fiercer, rage. This wasn't just about Daniel. It wasn't just about her brother being wrongfully convicted. It was about the system, the very system that had failed them, that had allowed corruption to flourish and innocent lives to be destroyed. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal, a failure of the justice system that was supposed to protect the vulnerable, the ones who couldn't defend themselves. And Lena wasn't going to let it slide. She spent sleepless nights poring over the details of the case. With every hour she spent researching, her anger grew. She began to uncover things that, at first, seemed too outrageous to be true: bribes taken by the judge, manipulations of evidence, and testimony that was clearly coerced. Lena found herself consumed by the desire to expose the truth, to reveal the corrupt underbelly of a system that was supposed to uphold justice but had instead become a tool for power and control. As she dug deeper, Lena began to realize just how deeply the rot ran. This wasn't an isolated case, it was part of a larger, systemic issue. The more she discovered, the more she saw how intertwined the corruption was, how many people had their hands dirty. The judge, the prosecutor, and even the police officers who had fabricated evidence. Lena's shock turned to disgust as she realized how far the corruption spread. It wasn't just her brother's case at stake anymore. It was an entire system that needed to be torn down, piece by piece, to restore any hope of justice. Lena knew that she couldn't do this alone. The system was too powerful, the forces working against her too great. But she refused to back down. She reached out to journalists, to activists, to anyone who might help her expose the truth. At first, they were skeptical, but as Lena presented her evidence, meticulously gathered, piece by piece, people began to listen. And with each passing day, the pressure on the judicial system mounted. The truth was beginning to seep out. But the fight wasn't easy. As Lena pushed harder, the backlash became fiercer. She received anonymous threats, letters warning her to back off, phone calls in the dead of night telling her to stop digging. She felt the weight of the danger pressing on her shoulders, but it only fueled her resolve. If she stopped now, the truth would be buried, and Daniel's case would be just another statistic in a long line of miscarriages of justice. Lena's fear grew, but so did her determination. She was no longer fighting for her brother alone. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged by a broken system. She was fighting for those whose voices had been silenced, for those who had no one else to turn to. She would not let this corrupt system continue to destroy innocent lives. Finally, after months of relentless work, the first cracks began to show. Investigations into the judge's actions were launched, and soon enough, the truth came out: he had been accepting bribes in exchange for favorable rulings. The prosecutor was caught tampering with evidence. The police officers involved in Daniel's case were fired. It was a long and grueling battle, but Lena saw the fruits of her labor. Daniel's case was reopened. After years of wrongful imprisonment, the truth was finally acknowledged. The evidence that had been ignored in the original trial was now taken seriously. The conviction was overturned, and Daniel was freed. But even as she held her brother, tears of relief mingling with anger, Lena knew this was just one victory in a war that was far from over. The battle had been won, but the war against the corrupt judicial system raged on. Lena's fight wasn't over. She had witnessed the depths of the corruption, and she knew that exposing one case wouldn't change everything. The system was still there, still grinding up the innocent, still perpetuating the lies that had allowed so much injustice to occur. But Lena was no longer the same woman who had walked into that courtroom months ago, helpless and full of grief. She had become something stronger, something fiercer. She had become a voice for the voiceless, a warrior against a corrupt system that had long outlived its usefulness. And she would keep fighting. For her brother, for the countless others like him, and for a justice system that still had a long way to go before it could truly be trusted again. The city below was a maze of lights and movement, but Emma stood still in the grand, glass-walled penthouse, her back turned to the view. The sight of the vast skyline stretched endlessly before her, every tower reflecting the success and wealth her father had built. Thomas Alden, her father, had molded the city with his own hands. Yet, as Emma gazed out from the heights of his empire, there was no thrill, no sense of pride in her chest. Instead, she felt a hollow ache, as if the very air she breathed was thick with the distance between her and the man who was supposed to love her. Thomas Alden was everything she wasn't. Powerful. Untouchable. A figure whose name commanded respect in the highest circles. A mogul whose ambition knew no bounds, whose reach could bend governments to his will. To the world, he was a king. To Emma, he was a phantom. A shadow that loomed in every corner of her life but never truly saw her. She was a whisper in his world, barely a footnote in the grand narrative of his success. He had built an empire, but at the cost of his relationship with his only daughter. The memories of childhood swirled in Emma's mind, lonely afternoons in this very penthouse, the quiet hum of the city below mingling with the silence inside. Her mother had long been absent, lost to the intricacies of Thomas's obsession with his work, and Emma was left to grow up in the sterile, lonely halls of their mansion. There was never any room for her. Her father's affection had always been reserved for business partners, for clients, for anyone who could contribute to the expansion of his empire. She could never compete with that. As she grew older, Emma had tried, desperately at times, to earn his affection. She excelled in her studies, took up business classes, and even spent hours at the office trying to get a glimpse of his world, hoping that perhaps, one day, he might see her. But every time, she was met with indifference. He didn't notice her accomplishments, he didn't celebrate her victories. His approval was a distant star in the sky, forever out of reach. And Emma had learned to accept it. After all, what else was there to do? But acceptance didn't mean peace. The ache had never gone away, and as she stood there now, watching the city sprawled before her, that ache felt sharper than ever. Her father was a man who had everything, but he had never cared about the one thing that mattered most, her. Tonight, like every night, Thomas hosted one of his grand galas. The room was filled with the city's elite, business magnates, politicians, and socialites, all gathered in the name of power. Thomas moved through the crowd like a man who owned the world, shaking hands, exchanging smiles, making deals with ease. His words were golden, his presence magnetic. He was the sun at the center of the universe, and everyone gravitated toward him. Everyone except Emma. She had been brought here tonight out of obligation. She could almost hear his voice in her mind now, commanding her to attend, to smile, to play the part of the daughter he was too busy to care for. As the evening wore on, Emma stood at the edge of the room, a silent observer, watching as her father's world unfolded before her. She was just a face in the crowd, no more significant than the expensive decor that adorned the room. Her heart twisted in her chest. Every smile she gave, every attempt to interact with the guests around her felt like a performance, a hollow act she was forced to play. She tried to make conversation, but her words fell flat, swallowed up by the roaring success of her father's empire. There were no meaningful exchanges here, no deep connections. Everything was transactional, like her relationship with Thomas. His affection had always been a currency, something to be earned, something to be used. She couldn't help but notice how he shone in the crowd, the way people listened to his every word, the way they looked at him with awe. It was as if he was untouchable, invincible. She, on the other hand, was invisible, a forgotten daughter in a sea of ambition. The pang of being overlooked by him, once a dull ache, now felt like a raw wound. Emma clenched her fists at her sides. Her father would never see her. He would never understand the woman she had become, the pain she had carried, the longing she had buried deep inside for years. It hurt in a way she couldn't describe. For so long, she had tried to earn his love. She had tried to be what he wanted her to be, to fit into the mold he had created for her. But it was all in vain. He was too consumed by his power, too wrapped up in his own world to notice the daughter who stood before him, aching for connection. Emma's thoughts began to churn, her mind racing with a mix of anger and resignation. She had spent so many years trying to be a part of his world, trying to make him proud, trying to carve out a place for herself in the shadow. But now, for the first time, she realized something that shook her to the core: she didn't need him. She didn't need his approval, his love, or his attention to define who she was. She was her own person, not a reflection of his greatness. The realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. She had spent her entire life chasing after something that would never come. But tonight, as she stood on the periphery of her father's world, something inside her shifted. It wasn't a sudden moment of clarity, it had been building for years, an undercurrent of self-discovery that had finally surfaced. She didn't need his love to be worthy. She didn't need his empire to make her feel powerful. As the night wore on, Emma made her way to the door, her movements deliberate and calm. She had long since given up on trying to get his attention. She could see his back, his head held high as he continued to entertain the guests. She could feel the weight of his indifference, the finality of it. But as she stepped out into the cool night air, something new stirred within her. There was no bitterness in her heart, no anger left. She was free. Her father would never see her for who she truly was, and that was okay. Emma had spent too much of her life trying to be seen by someone who couldn't see her. It was time to step away, to forge her own path. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt ready to walk it on her own. The city around her was bustling with life, but Emma felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. She didn't need her father's approval anymore. She had come to understand that her worth wasn't tied to him or the empire he had built. She was Emma Alden, standing on her own 2 feet, ready to build her own legacy. And as the night sky stretched out before her, Emma knew that her story was just beginning. The heavy steel bars of the cell loomed before Daniel Hayes, cold and impenetrable, an ever-present reminder of the years he had lost and the life he could never reclaim. Prison had become a second skin, the oppressive walls a cage not only for his body but for his spirit as well. Yet, even in the darkest depths of this suffocating place, there was something that still refused to die: the will to fight. It had started as a whisper, a quiet thought buried beneath the weight of despair, but over time, it had grown louder, more insistent. Justice. His mind fixated on it, consumed by the notion that, somehow, it could still be within his grasp. Daniel had been wronged. He knew that. The case against him had been nothing more than a carefully constructed web of lies, a tragic product of a justice system that valued power and influence over truth. The trial had been a farce, a performance designed to maintain the status quo, and Daniel had been its unwitting victim. The judge, once a symbol of fairness and integrity, had played his part in the grand deception. His conviction had been a formality, preordained and sealed by the unseen forces that shaped the fate of so many like him. The law had failed him, and in that failure, Daniel had been left to rot, his life reduced to a mere statistic, a nameless face in a sea of injustice. But somewhere, deep inside, a shift had occurred. His anger had not been a bitter, consuming rage, but a quiet determination, a desire not only to clear his name but to expose the ugliness of a system that had allowed such corruption to fester. He had been imprisoned for years, trapped behind bars with nothing but his thoughts and the bitter taste of betrayal. And yet, despite the years of suffering, he had never allowed himself to completely surrender. His mind, though shackled by the prison walls, had remained free, relentlessly searching for a way out. His cell was his sanctuary and his prison. Surrounded by nothing but the silence of the concrete walls, Daniel had often felt as though the world had forgotten him. The outside world continued to spin, indifferent to his plight. His family had long since moved on, the weight of his conviction too much to bear. But Daniel couldn't accept that. He couldn't accept that this would be the end of his story. It started with the small things, the reading of case files, the scribbling of notes on torn pieces of paper, the quiet hours spent in the prison library searching for precedents, legal loopholes, and stories of people who had fought back against the system. Daniel's world, confined to a small, dimly lit cell, was expanding, filling with the possibilities of what might be. Each day, his resolve grew stronger. He could feel the seeds of hope taking root within him. This wasn't just about proving his innocence, this was about showing the world that the justice system could be broken and that it could be fixed. Daniel's first attempts at reaching out to the outside world had been met with indifference. The letters he sent, filled with his desperate plea for help, were ignored by most. The world had no reason to care for a man like him, a man wrongfully convicted and left to rot in a cell. But Daniel didn't stop. He wrote to journalists, to law firms, to activists. Slowly, ever so slowly, his story began to be heard. The cracks in the case against him started to surface, and with each passing day, his voice grew louder. Then, there was Rachel Turner, a young lawyer with a fierce determination that matched Daniel's own. She had spent years working on cases like his, uncovering miscarriages of justice, fighting for those who had been cast aside by a broken system. When she first read about Daniel's case, she felt something stir within her, a recognition of the injustice that had been done to him, a deep-seated anger at the corruption that had led to his wrongful conviction. She knew she couldn't let it go. Rachel contacted Daniel, and a new chapter in his fight began. With Rachel's help, Daniel's case gained momentum. She meticulously dug through the files, uncovering the shoddy investigations and false testimonies that had been the cornerstone of his conviction. She rallied support, reaching out to other lawyers, media outlets, and activists. One by one, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Daniel's innocence wasn't just an abstract idea anymore, it was a truth that was beginning to resurface, like a long-forgotten relic waiting to be discovered. It wasn't easy. The system fought back fiercely, trying to silence the truth with every legal maneuver it could muster. But Rachel and Daniel's resolve was unshakable. They knew the odds were stacked against them, but they also knew that every step forward was a victory. Every moment spent exposing the corruption, every legal challenge, was a moment closer to the justice Daniel had been denied for so long. The trial that would eventually clear Daniel's name was a battle of its own. The courtroom was charged with tension, filled with the weight of the truth finally coming to light. The defense team, led by Rachel, tore apart the prosecution's case piece by piece, revealing the lies and the misconduct that had kept Daniel locked away for so many years. The witnesses who had been silenced now found the courage to speak. The judge, once the embodiment of the system's supposed impartiality, was revealed to be complicit in the conspiracy that had condemned an innocent man to prison. When the moment came, when the judge declared Daniel's conviction overturned and his name cleared, it felt surreal. For a moment, Daniel couldn't comprehend it. Years of pain, suffering, and isolation had led to this one moment, his freedom. As the weight of the words sunk in, tears welled in his eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of relief, of release. The chains that had bound him for so long were finally gone. But freedom wasn't just about stepping out of the courtroom. It was about what came next, the rebuilding of a life that had been shattered. Daniel wasn't the same man who had entered prison all those years ago. The years had changed him, hardened him, but they had also given him a purpose. He was no longer a victim of the system, he was a symbol of resistance, of the possibility of change. His story was no longer just his own, it was a rallying cry for all those who had been wronged, a testament to the power of truth and perseverance. As Daniel walked out of the courthouse, the sun shining down on his face, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, but not in the way he had once felt it. This time, it was the weight of responsibility. He knew that his fight was not over. There were still countless others trapped in the system, still countless lives being destroyed by the same corruption and incompetence that had tried to break him. And he would be there, standing with them, as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, the light of justice can break through.